Hello and welcome to Nocab Game Design. Today, we're playing through the second combat operation of Chapter 15 titled Sylvaria's Last Stand. This is a hard level. It's one of the last combat operations of the game, so it's expected to be quite challenging, but it's not necessarily a unique level. As I'll discuss later in this video, this level shares a mission profile with that of the Chapter 10 combat operation. This gives us a unique opportunity to compare and contrast and learn what exactly differentiates a mid-game and a late-game level. What are the elements or variables that we as game designers can play with to make a level worthy of being a late-game boss encounter? Because yes, this is a boss encounter. Same with Chapter 10. Truly a unique opportunity. But before we discuss the mission profile, we'll quickly consider and analyze the level architecture. This is a special one because this level also features a symmetric floor plan, something this game hasn't done before. So why do the developers feel the need to put in a symmetric level here? And more importantly, what does this do to the gameplay? Stay tuned and find out. So, let's play. First things first, the most important aspect of any level is the architecture, so we'll start there. The first thing that I think most players will notice about this level is that it's not a linear level at all. The term I'll use to describe it is wide. This is a wide level, or at least it's not very deep or straightforward. The goal of this level is to storm the fortress and kill Sylvaria, but she is way up at the top of the northern part of the fort. Getting up there is not easy. There's no direct path to the top of the battlement. Instead, the player needs to navigate the labyrinth that this level architecture presents. The characters need to weave through the fortifications and ultimately touch every corner of this map in order to get up to Sylvaria. Squad 7 starts the level in a bad spot, right in the middle of this cauldron, surrounded by snipers who rain fire down onto the player, not to mention Sylvaria herself with an incredibly accurate machine gun that deals a lot of damage. She also runs back and forth, ensuring she can always find a good angle, which is quite dangerous for the player characters. But before I get too sidetracked and start talking about the boss unit herself, let's continue with the architectural analysis. In this starting area, the bottom of the cauldron as I called it, there are a lot of buildings. These are placed here intentionally, and they are the only cover available to the player. Now, these buildings are not true cover, they don't provide the defensive bonuses associated with crouching behind sandbags or trenches, but they do break the line of sight in certain directions. Now, notice it's not every direction, and Sylvaria runs back and forth, so she can get good sight lines down some of these pathways, and is able to kill units that are attempting to hide in here. So, again, it's not perfect cover, but these buildings do act as decent cover on the player's turn as they're moving about. The point I'm trying to illustrate here is that the architecture is specifically designed to increase the challenge of the level. It doesn't afford any defensible positions to the player, which ultimately causes the characters to rapidly lose health, or if you play it safe, then it costs the player time. Spending your action to heal instead of shooting, or staying put behind a wall instead of using the full range of a character's mobility, is effectively the same as giving the player slower units or units that don't have as much health. The level architecture here is clearly designed to increase the game's difficulty, and it does that very effectively. Good design. But this architecture is also quite complex. Remember, difficulty plus complexity equals challenge. This is not a very big level, at least it's not a big floor plan. Earlier I said it was wide, not deep. Temporally, this is quite a large level. It takes about an hour to play through. In other words, the map itself is not very big, but it takes a long time to go through it. This level features a lot of zigzags, long looping paths, and a density of content. The player is forced to visit every corner of this map in order to progress. No space is wasted. Even the parts that appear to be a straight hallway are cluttered with debris, sandbags, enemies, or just stuff that prevents a player from running in a straight line. The map is like a convoluted labyrinth, and this is good design. Kind of. In the olden days of arcade cabinets, or even the first home console, computer memory was expensive, so game designers did everything they could to squeeze a few more minutes of gameplay out of every map. Forcing a player to double back and visit every inch of a level map was a good way to do this. Think about the Pac-Man maps, literally forcing a player to step on every available tile in a maze-like map before moving on to the next level. At the time, that was excellent design, but now computer technology has evolved somewhat. Game designers can create large, sprawling maps that are effectively empty because computer memory has become so cheap. But should they? Well, it kind of depends on the game that you're trying to make, but generally speaking, no. Large, empty levels tend to feel a bit boring and dull. Maybe that's what you're going for, but generally speaking, players are expecting constant stimulation, constant content. This level is complex and dense, but that's good design. It's what the player is expecting. It's what the player wants. And this leads into my next point about the level architecture, the emotional impact it conveys. This is a desperate level. Squad 7 starts under heavy suppressive fire. Even the starting spawn camp isn't safe, and units can die just by stepping out of cover for a few moments. Snipers are constantly raining fire down on the player, and each corner has a machine gunner firing at the player. Nowhere is safe. The architecture of this level literally puts the enemies on the high ground, forcing the player to fight uphill into well-defended positions. All of this builds an emotional experience for the player, and I've talked about games as an authored experience before, and this level is a masterful example of such. But it's subtle. The level architecture alone is the driving force behind the emotional punch here. Not the story, not the mission profile, but the physical architecture makes the player feel lost and surrounded. If there were just a few more defensive walls or a few less zigzags, then this level would not be nearly as impactful as it currently is. Good design. Now, as promised in the intro, let's talk about the level symmetry. This is the first symmetric level of the game, and the first symmetric level that this channel has discussed. So the natural first question is, why? Why make a symmetric level? What does a symmetric level do to the gameplay? How does this impact the player's experience? Okay, maybe those are 3 questions, not 1. But still, what's the deal with the symmetric level? Ultimately, the symmetry here is used to make the level more challenging, and I'll get to the how in a moment. But first, let's take stock. Because of the symmetry here, the player effectively has to play the same level twice, once on the left and once on the right, but it's not a perfect copy. The level architecture is mostly symmetric. Both sides have base camps in the same place, and the hallway layout is the same. But the left and the right lobes have slightly different enemy units. Additionally, the clutter and buildings that exist in the hallways is laid out differently. And probably the largest asymmetry is the player characters themselves.
I'm a weapon. No, a shield.
The player is only allowed to have 9 units in the map at once, in odd number. One side is always going to be a man down. So while the 2 halves of the level are symmetric, they're not identical. Ultimately, the 2 sides will converge and smash Sylvaria at the top, and you really need to flank Sylvaria to take her on. She has high dodge rates and massive damage, so the most effective way to take on this boss is with flanking maneuvers. Have a unit on either side of her and take turns surprising her, which prevents the dodge. With that background in mind, let's return to the question, why? And as I said a moment ago, the symmetry is used to make the level harder. And as we know, there are only 2 ways to increase the challenge. Increase the difficulty or increase the complexity. And the developers do both here. First, the difficulty increases. The main way the devs achieve this is by forcing the player to split their units. Now, the player doesn't technically have to split their units, but the architecture definitely encourages the player to, and I think most casual players will. But splitting your forces does increase the difficulty. Now you have to fight the battle not with 9 units, but with 5 or 4. Resources are effectively being taken away from the player, and it gets worse. The tank units are largely blocked off from the fight. There are some pathways that are just too narrow or too long for a tank to be effectively used. The lessons here: to increase the difficulty, use the architecture to reduce the player's resources, splitting the team in half and further creating filters to drain out units. Next, this symmetry also increases the complexity. By splitting the player's attention and making them fight 2 battles simultaneously, the developers are increasing the cognitive complexity of the level and thus increasing the challenge. This is the exact same design technique that was used all the way back in Chapter 3. That was the video which I formally introduced the game design term complexity. If you haven't watched that video, then go check it out. This part will make a lot more sense once you've seen that. And this level is quite complex. There is a lot going on. The player needs to constantly ensure they end their turn in a safe place to avoid sniper fire. Managing resources like grenades or movement range is critical, and even the asymmetry of the unit composition in the two encounters poses new problems. One side presents a machine gun nest while the other presents a tank. The player needs slightly different tools to address these challenges effectively. The lesson here, in the late game, once the player has demonstrated mastery of the game, don't be afraid to turn up the complexity. Start layering complex elements while also turning up the difficulty. This is a difficult and complex level. Good design. So far, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about this level's bones, its architecture. But now, let's talk about the meat and muscle of this level, the mission profile. What is the player's objective, and how do the developers encourage the player to go about it? What is the animating force of this level? What is the mission profile? Well, in simple terms, the goal is to destroy the enemy boss unit. But let's look at it in a little more detail here. The boss unit is physically elevated and located at the northernmost point of the map. To defeat the boss, the player needs to weave their way through a complicated, well-defended structure and get into a firing position. And this is not the first time the developers have used this exact same mission profile. Back in level 10 is when this level type was first introduced. That was the episode where we formally defined the relationship between difficulty, complexity, and challenge for the first time. A quite important episode, too. If you remember, in Chapter 10, we were fighting an armored rail car as we stormed the 1,000 concentration camps. But this is 5 chapters later. So what's changed, and what's stayed the same? This level gives us a unique opportunity to compare and contrast, and hopefully learn something for our own games. Let's start with the similarities. Both levels have the same mission profile, the objective, what the player is trying to do, and how the enemies are laid out. To talk about this explicitly, the player has to storm a well-defended enemy stronghold and kill the enemy boss unit located at the topmost point. The boss unit patrols left to right on their turn, has an excellent vantage point, and is constantly laying down suppressive fire into the player, which makes it difficult to move around this maze-like complicated structure. The architectures are similar also, both densely packed with camps and enemy units with lots of twisting and convoluted paths. Both have mission objectives that are located in the extreme corners of the map, filling everything out. Both levels feature the elevator, which acts as a shortcut or checkpoint through the complicated labyrinth, allowing the player to flood in and make incremental progress. And to be quite honest, these are a lot of similarities. These two levels are clearly two examples of the same game design idea. They're effectively the same level. Now, a distance of 5 chapters corresponds to about 8 to 10 hours of gameplay. That's enough distance to prevent this from feeling like a cheap copy of the earlier level. But because these levels are so similar, it's by studying the differences that we can learn something for our own games. And a lot of the differences are things that I've already talked about in this video. This is a later level, so it's expected to be much more challenging. And it is. This level is much, much harder. It features stronger enemies. The tank destroyer unit is the most powerful non-boss unit in the game. The fortress is packed with black elite foot units, also quite powerful in their own right, and they have quite well guarded positions, making them tricky to deal with. The architecture is much harder. Symmetry splits the player's forces, increasing the difficulty and complexity. Squad 7 starts in the low ground with poor cover. The enemy spawn rates feel higher in this level too. All these differences are things that drive up the challenge of the level.
You're gonna get shot.
The last major difference is the boss unit itself. In Chapter 10, the boss effectively took a single bullet to defeat by exploding a bomb, destroying the bridge. But here in Chapter 15, Valkyria takes several actions of back and forth machine gun attacks to take her down. Funny, Valkyria is more tanky than an armored train. I've talked about flow theory previously, how the challenge presented must grow with a player's rising skill. And we can see this when we compare the Chapter 10 and Chapter 15 boss encounters. They're clearly the same level template, but the latter level is much more challenging. In this episode, we talked about how exactly the developers increased the challenge, mostly with architectural tricks and increased potency of the enemy units themselves. At the end here, I touched on why that's important. Because this is a late game level, the player is expecting a major showdown against an important enemy character. This is a masterpiece level, tying major plot progression to experience-based gameplay, making the player feel like they earned the victory by presenting a challenge that the player is expecting, but not one that is overly unfamiliar or unfair. This level is good design, not just by itself, but placed within the context of the entire game. It's clear that the entire rest of the game has been building up to moments like this. Earlier levels expose the player to this mission profile, or introduce new mechanics, or present the player with some type of complexity. And once all the pieces are in place and the player is properly trained on how to manage them, then the developers have a free hand to use all the game design tools available to create a masterful level. This game, showcases good design. Thanks for watching. This video is a bit of a longer one than usual, but what can I say? There's just so much to talk about in this level. It's so rich and full of important topics to discuss. I hope my enthusiasm for game design is able to help you learn something, or see the games you play in a slightly different way. Even if you're not actively developing anything right now, applying game criticism to the games you play can allow you to appreciate the piece more fully. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or subscribing. It sounds cliche, but it really does help. Even knowing that there's one person out there who shares a passion for game design or was able to learn something new makes all the effort I put into these videos worth it. In the next episode, Squad 7 rushes to take out the secret superweapon of the Empire. The Marmota attacks. I'll see you there.
Valkyria.